Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is episode 14, Why Minsky Matters. And by the way, Dylan is once again not joining us for this episode because, believe it or not, the bastard is still sunbathing in Hawaii. And so I'm stuck here by myself talking about economics. Isn't that just great? So, who is Minsky, or who was Minsky? Minsky was an American economist, a very important economist in my opinion, made a lot of predictions and wrote a lot of very accurate and consistent and empirical analyses of, capitalism or the economy in general. And why does he matter? Well, because in my opinion, he's probably one of the most empirical economists that I have come across in my readings. I've read a lot of Austrian economics, and obviously, in undergrad school, a lot of standard Keynesian stuff and that kind of literature. But nobody that I've come across, at least, has been as empirical and as hands-on as Minsky when it comes to understanding our modern-day economy. In particular, the banking system, the relevance of banking. Also, Minsky is not really easy to categorize ideologically. He doesn't fit in one box ideologically. Some people may call him left-wing because he promoted a federal job guarantee. Some might call him right-wing because he was against any corporate income taxes at all. He actually, in my opinion, accurately pointed out that a corporate tax is just a complete pass-through to the consumers ultimately. So what I want to do today is I just want to read from a book that is called Why Minsky Matters. And it's a book written by Randall Wray, who is a modern monetary theory economist. And we will, of course, provide the links in the show notes. And I just want to read out some of the most important paragraphs that I've come across, which there's a lot of, so I don't think we will get it all into one episode, but we can get started and see where it goes. So, the first quote that I want to get into here is page 15. Minsky argued that the internal dynamics of our modern-day economy are not equilibrium-seeking. There's no invisible hand operating that way. Furthermore, if we ever did achieve the mainstream's beloved equilibrium, those internal dynamics would push us away. The system is not stable. And if by some miracle we were to get twice lucky, achieving an equilibrium that was stable, stability is destabilizing. This is because quiescence changes behavior, policymaking, and business opportunities. Chairman Bernanke's great moderation could not have been a stable equilibrium because market participants took into account the moderation, discounting the likelihood of black swans and fat tails. They took on more risk. A stable economy also makes it ever more difficult to find profitable opportunities as markets tend to become saturated. Finally, economic stability promotes fiscal tightening through automatic stabilizers that increase tax revenue and lower some kinds of spending, and monetary policy tightening. It also promotes financial deregulation on the argument that the system is more stable. These policy tendencies promote risk-taking. All of these elements ensured that the system would move from a robust structure to a fragile financial profile. So, this is of course important because the neoclassical consensus, and also a lot of people in the Austrian economic circles believe that there's some free market economy that arose out of individuals freely bartering with one another. And so the price always reflects the supply and demand of goods and services needed. And the prices are always market clearing if they're allowed to be formulated or set freely. And that will lead to equilibrium. That's the standard belief. And if we have bad regulations or external shocks or anything like that, that tends to move the market away from equilibrium and towards instability. And the instability can be attained if the shocks abate or if the bad regulations are removed. So that's sort of the standard belief. But Minsky said that, our capitalist system, our monetary system, which is entirely, by the way, top-down imposed, there's nothing free market about the existing monetary system as is. But Minsky argued that the system is not in its nature stable. It always moves towards instability. And if it ever becomes stable, as I pointed out here, people become more reckless. And that makes perfect sense. If things look promising down the road, if the economy booms, if profits are great, if everything's great, then that makes people more reckless. And when people get more reckless, they will their financial position will deteriorate, and they will go into more debt, and then that becomes unsustainable. And this is one of the most fundamental differences, one of the distinguishing factors between Minsky and almost all other mainstream economists, is that the market, the so-called free market, does not move towards equilibrium. It moves towards instability, and stability is destabilizing. So anytime we have a lot of stability, we need to be worried about the instability that will come down the road. And that's basically what this is about. So let's jump here to page 25. Okay. Minsky left copious bound class notes from courses he had with Lange and Knight, and these reinforce his claim that economics at Chicago in those days was taught as part of the study of society, where economic history, political science, sociology, anthropology, and economics were part of an integrated sequence aimed at understanding modern society, which he claimed to be vastly superior to the usual practice of teaching economics in isolation in a specialized course. If I had my way, the standard American course in economics would be introduced in the context of social sciences and history. The current American way of teaching economics leads to American economists who are well trained but poorly educated. So this is about Minsky's days at Chicago, because he actually went to university at Chicago, where Milton Friedman, by the way, also went. And Minsky had a huge appreciation for the Chicago schools sort of big picture approach to economics, as opposed to, which I believe is sort of the Harvard cliche, which is, they had their curves and their ISLMDB curves and their graphs, and they were just trying to make sense of economics sort of geometrically and mathematically. And Minsky wasn't into that at all. He was more into, we have to understand the history, we have to understand the institutions that are running our economics or our societal instruments. Well, here we are, institutions versus instruments. We talked about that a couple of episodes back. Societies always set up instruments to solve problems, and those instruments turn to institutions. Anyway, moving on to page 29. In one of his first publications, Minsky analyzed the development of the Fed funds market in the United States, the interbank market where banks lend reserves to one another to meet clearing drains, as well as legally required reserve ratios. At the time, this was a relatively new financial innovation. Most people thought that the quantity of reserves constrains bank lending, since they would need to accumulate reserves before lending in order to be sure that they would not be caught short. Minsky, however, argued that banks use the Fed funds market to economize on reserves. No bank would need to hold any extra reserves, called excess reserves, since they could lend them at interest to other banks that needed them. This would make it difficult for the Federal Reserve to influence lending activity or money creation by trying to constrain reserves. According to Minsky, bank lending would not be determined by the quantity of reserves they held, but rather by the willingness of banks to lend and of their customers to borrow. If they then needed reserves for clearing or to meet legal reserve requirements, they would simply go to the Fed funds market to borrow them. So you may have, if you have listened to this podcast before, you may have heard Dylan and I talk about this over and over. The federal funds rate is declared by the Federal Reserve and maintained by the Federal Reserve by selling bonds into the interbank market, and nowadays actually by simply paying interest on reserves, which is basically the same thing, just a different method. But there's this theory that is called the fractional reserve banking theory, which says that banks hold reserves and they lend out, based on the reserves that they have, they lend out so and so much of those reserves. So if somebody puts $100 in my bank, I can now apparently loan out $1,000. That would be a 10% reserve ratio. But Minsky, because he hung out with bankers, understood that that's not how banking works. Has never worked that way, doesn't work that way, and probably won't ever work that way. Because banks create bank loans out of nowhere and later on obtain the reserves if they need them. And as this paragraph here points out, they'll just borrow them on the federal funds market if needed. So there's also the legal reserve requirement, which is basically there are laws or regulations that the Fed put in place to say every bank needs to hold 10% in 10% of their assets in reserves. Which means that, which basically, in effect, I've talked about this before. It's really just a tax on the banks, right? There's no constraint that is put on the bank in terms of its lending. The bank's just going to make a loan when they find a willing and able borrower, and they're going to obtain the reserves when they need them. They're not starving for reserves and waiting for reserves so they can finally lend again. That's not how it works. Banks lend first and then obtain reserves later. The reserves are an afterthought. Okay. So then we're moving on to page 41 here, where it talks about Minsky's views on capitalism, essentially. So Minsky had some ideas on how to reform capitalism as we know it. which is basically the capitalism that he observed, so a system where the federal government imposes a tax and spends money into existence, and banks are the federal government's agent who lend money into existence. This is what we call free market capitalism today, right? But it's a top-down imposed system. It's important to understand. That's just my preface here. So, on reforming capitalism, Minsky provided a number of general proposals to reform capitalism, to make it more stable as well as more equitable. Here is a summary of his main policy proposals. We save for later more specific proposals to deal with the problem of money manager capitalism and excessive financialization of the economy. Sorry, before I read this, let me just jump back here because this is also another thing that you don't hear a lot of economists talk about, but Minsky, because he was so into the big picture and looking at the institutions and the history, he understood that there's tons of varieties of capitalism. And so I'm just jumping to a paragraph prior to this one here. Following his institutionalist roots, Minsky argued that there are 57 varieties of capitalism. So the death of money manager capitalism may be replaced with a new, more stable form. Money manager capitalism being, according to Minsky, the stage that we entered in, that we're sort of still in right now, which is basically a system where pension funds and hedge funds and big university endowments, like just very large money groups, control the flow of funds and where money goes and where loans go, etc. But we'll get into that later. Anyway, so we save for later more specific proposals to deal with the problem of money manager capitalism and excessive financialization of the economy. So reforming capitalism, the first step here: big government, size, spending, taxing. According to Minsky, government must be large enough so that the swings of its budget are sufficient to offset the swings of private investment. This definition dictates that government spending should be approximately the same order of magnitude as or larger than investment. Following Keynes, Minsky believed that the most volatile component of private spending is investment in plant and equipment. If the government is big enough, and if its budget swings counter-cyclically, that can offset fluctuation of investment and hence stabilize aggregate demand. By this measure, the US federal government, at about a fifth of GDP, so 20%, is more than large enough, as it is substantially larger than investment. So, you may have different opinions. I may have different opinions on that. I don't want a large government, but I do understand that due to the fluctuations in the system, that the state capitalist system that is being created by government taxing and spending money into existence and banks loaning money into existence and people needing the money for the tax and to pay off bank loans, that there's these swings in private investment that need to be offset by a federal government deficit. And in my ideal world, at least, it would all be done through tax adjustment, tax cuts. No additional spending is needed to increase the deficit. Even now, even today, especially today, right? We could achieve a lot just by slashing taxes across the board, big time. So moving on here. Minsky made this proposal when U.S. trade with foreign nations was essentially balanced and when consumption by households was fairly stable, passively adjusting to changes of household income. However, international trade has become more important, and swings of the trade deficit introduce more instability for the U.S. economy. We've talked about this, by the way, on Amagi podcast. Furthermore, consumption also has become less stable, as households rely increasingly on credit to finance spending, which Minsky started to recognize in the early 90s. In a downturn, consumers cut back on borrowing and spending, making matters worse. For these reasons, our big government's budget probably needs to be larger than investment spending. This means, for example, that at full employment, the budget should be about 20% of GDP. Below full employment, spending would be somewhat more than that, while tax revenues would be less. Above full employment, tax revenues would exceed 20% of GDP, while spending might be less. The counter-cyclical swing of the budget would take demand out of the economy in a boom and add demand in a slump. This situation would help to offset swings of private spending. With regard to taxes, Minsky believed that most taxes are inflationary because they add to costs. In particular, he argued that the portion of Social Security tax paid by employers, as well as the corporate income tax, are costs passed along in prices. In addition, Minsky feared that the payroll tax encourages substitution of capital for labor, more machines, fewer workers. He thus advocated elimination of the corporate income tax as well as the employer portion of the payroll tax. So, I know there's a libertarian network, so come on, you can get on board with that at least. I know there's a lot of talk about government spending, but slashing corporate and payroll tax, that's a great idea. He supported a broad-based value-added tax as an alternative. These are sales taxes on consumption and are common in Europe. He also supported greater use of excise and sin taxes to influence behavior. In particular, he advocated a much larger tax on petroleum to reduce its use. Well, I completely disagree with that, but, that's not an economic disagreement. Employment, strategy, and inflation. Minsky wanted to reorder spending priorities toward employment programs, child allowances, and public infrastructure investment, and away from defense and non-old age survivors' disability and hospital insurance transfers. He believed that an employment program could substitute for most transfers other than those aimed at the aged, which would allow substantial cuts in non-defense spending. So this is also important to point out here, a lot of the spending that Minsky advocates could easily be offset by other spending cuts. Finally, he wanted to dispense with automatic cost of living adjustments and transfer payments so that inflation would move the government's budget towards balance by increasing tax revenues through bracket creep while advocating automatic increases of social spending. This would help to attenuate the thrust to inflation when the economy operates at full employment. Part of the reason Minsky wanted to reduce transfers, e.g. welfare, food stamps, and unemployment, is because he was convinced that those transfers impart an inflationary bias to the economy. In his view, the level of aggregate demand determines the markup of prices and the aggregate level over aggregate costs of production, primarily wages. As social spending generates income and adds to aggregate demand without contributing much to aggregate supply, the markup over costs is higher. As transfer payments rise relative to output, prices rise. If government spending could be shifted away from policies to raise aggregate demand without increasing production to those that would increase both aggregate demand as well as aggregate supply, then prices would be lower, in particular public infrastructure development, as well as job creation through an employer of last resort program rather than welfare, would reduce inflation by increasing capacity to supply along with increasing demand. So we have also talked on this podcast, of course, about the federal job guarantee. That's what he calls the employer of last resort program here. And then there's also Minsky advocated corporate reform. While the corporate form is necessary in an economy with extremely expensive capital assets, according to Minsky, this sort of institutional arrangement facilitates the divorce of financing from the ownership and acquisition of particular assets. Consequently, the corporation, initially a device for extending hedge financing to long-lasting capital assets, can be a vehicle for speculative finance. and because it facilitates both capital-intensive modes of production and speculative financing, a destabilizing influence. What Minsky is saying is that the creation of corporations helped to provide funds for investment, since firms could sell stocks. However, the modern stock market is used mostly for speculation, not for financing new capital stock. He believed that policies could reduce the instability-enhancing power of corporations. Some of the policies he advanced were elimination of the corporate income tax, which leads to a bias in favor of debt financing over equity financing, as well as to leveraged buyouts that increase indebtedness of the takeover targets. Since interest receives favorable tax treatment, borrowing is encouraged. He also pushed for policies that would favor employment of labor over investment in physical capital, such as elimination of the payroll tax on employers. High employment is stabilizing, as it induces growth based on consumption rather than investment. And as we mentioned earlier, investment spending is much more volatile than consumer spending, to the extent that consumer spending is financed out of earnings, which is also currently due to credit cards and stuff, which are, not good. I think they're an aberration. Consumer spending has also become more volatile. And then, the final subsection here under reforming capitalism is market power. Counter-cyclical government deficits maintain profit flows, allowing firms to meet their debt commitments. Minsky saw no alternative to such policy on an aggregate level. Big government's budget needs to help stabilize the economy. However, it is essential that individual firms and banks are allowed to fail. Otherwise, there is no market discipline. In Minsky's view, the primary incentive to obtaining market power is the ability to set prices at a sufficient level to service debt. In the small government form of capitalism, that is, the kind of capitalism we had before World War II, collusion and government policy may be warranted to try to maintain prices in conditions of low demand. However, in big government capitalism, where government deficits maintain profits, there is no need for policy to foster market power that protects profits. Indeed, Minsky feared that conditions favoring large monopolies would be detrimental because they would lead to firms that are too big to fail. Thus, he favored policies that would reduce the incentives to bigness. In particular, he believed that policies that favor medium-sized banks would also favor medium-sized firms, as bank size determines, to a large extent, the size of customers. Big banks serve big customers, while medium-sized banks serve medium-sized customers. A decentralized banking system with many small and independent banks is conducive to an industrial structure made up of mainly small and medium-sized firms. Policies that would promote such a system include elimination of much of the segmentation of activities, such as commercial banking and investment, and then in parentheses, for small to medium-sized banks, so they could provide a wide range of services to their small to medium-sized customers, end of bracket. Uniform and high capital-to-asset ratios, this would favor smaller banks as these typically have higher ratios, and freer entry. Minsky also argued that industrial policy should not only favor smaller firms, but could also favor employment over capital-intensive production techniques. Smaller firms tend to use more labor-intensive techniques because their ability to finance purchase of long-lived, expensive capital assets is lower. He also favored regulation and government intervention into specific markets wherever this would promote competition. Though he agreed with orthodoxy that competitive markets are devices to promote efficiency, he went on to note that the market is an adequate regulator of products and processes except when market power or externalities exist. Once they exist, whether caused by the government or by market processes, regulation can be necessary to constrain the exercise of power. So this would be an example where, for example, Dylan and I have talked about the banking system, right? The banks have a lot of market power because they've been given that privilege by the government. So they have to be regulated by the government. Continuing. Thus, an industrial policy that takes the form of promoting competitive industry, facilitating financing, and aiding and abetting the development of a labor force that is trained and productive is highly desirable. Note, by the way, that he credited his Chicago teacher, Henry Simmons, for this insight. He also saw industrial policy as a viable alternative to antitrust prosecution, which he believed to be a failure because it cannot create the conditions required to permit smaller firms to prosper. That pretty much speaks for itself, I think. So, moving on to page 58. Minsky called Keynes' theory of boom and bust an investment theory of the cycle. In contrast to mainstream theories that saw cycles as the result of bad policy, fooling, or technology shocks. Oh, sorry, it ends there. Okay, sorry. So Minsky called Keynes' theory an investment theory of the cycle. Okay, because Keynes wrote about how a recession begins when investment starts to fall off. And continuing, importantly, Keynes had an endogenous theory of the cycle. It is in the nature of capitalism to cycle due to whirlwinds of optimism and pessimism. The cycle is thus related to the investment decisions, which depends on expectations about an inherently uncertain future. It is the uncertainty that generates a preference for liquid assets, and thus a barrier to achieving full employment. Again, firms produce only what they expect to sell at profit, and it is not necessary for them to have been disappointed or to be subject to unstable economic forces in order for the sum of their individual production decisions to leave some labor resources unused. If the future looks problematic, firms decide not to invest, and wealth holders decide to seek liquid assets, often called hoarding money or a run to quality. That is, to assets with relatively low risk, such as government bonds or even currency. And Dylan and I have talked about this. We talk about net private savings a lot. That's essentially what this is. Liquidity is net private savings. And we've also talked about the permanent portfolio and how you can protect yourself from crises and crashes, and that is by diversifying and holding long-term government bonds in your portfolio. That's the Amagi episode called The Permanent Portfolio, in case you're interested. Keynes famously remarked that no one in a neoclassical world would hold money because there could be no value to holding a riskless, hence low-return asset. This was later confirmed by Frank Hahn, who lamented that there is no room for money in the rigorous orthodox model. This is because such models ignore uncertainty and bankruptcy. Very important. The major economic models that are still at the root of a lot of our institutions and our economic coursework, our economic thinking, essentially suggest that there is no uncertainty and there is no bankruptcy. I mean, they introduce uncertainty through, external shocks, etc. But again, when the shock goes away, the system returns to equilibrium. And he just points out here, technically there's really no need for money in such a system. And it was Keynes who pointed out, I don't know if he was first there or whatever, but just by the by, when I say Keynes, I mean literally what Keynes himself wrote, not what Keynesians later on made of the stuff he wrote, because Keynes himself actually wrote some good stuff and made some pretty accurate, astute observations. But he suggests the main reason why we desire some degree of liquidity is uncertainty, which makes perfect sense. Charles Goodhart insists that the possibility of default is central to any analysis of a money-using economy, as decisions about production made today commit entrepreneurs to payments in the future. There's the possibility that they will not be able to meet contractual terms. However, the most rigorous orthodox models explicitly rule out default, implying that all IOUs are risk-free, thereby eliminating any need for the monitoring services provided by financial institutions. Not only is there no room for money in these models, there's also no need for banks or other financial intermediaries. Financial instability is also ruled out, because absence of the possibility of default requires perfect foresight or complete and perfect markets so that all outcomes can be hedged. Thus, these mainstream macro models cannot incorporate the real-world features that Keynes included: animal spirits and degree of confidence, market psychology, and liquidity preference. By contrast, Keynes's basic model is easily extended to account for heterogeneous credit ratings, to allow default to affect expectations, and to include contagions and other repercussions set off by default of one large economic entity on its commitments. The best example of such extensions is the work of Minsky. So once again here, our standard models rule out default. But, our standard models and even heterodox schools like the Austrian school, they look at banks as intermediaries. So banks by themselves are not originators of credit, at least in the ideal system that they envision. The banks are just an intermediary because they collect deposits and then they lend out the money that's been deposited with them, which, as I just explained earlier, is not how banking has ever worked. It's not how it works, and it's probably not how it ever will work. Banking is, maybe it will one day, who knows, but banking is, at the moment and throughout history, it's always been a government program. Banks are the government's accredited lending agents, and they create money by making loans. That's also, by the way, the reason why for every loan there's a deposit. Right? We always say this, right? For every loan there must be a deposit. So that must mean that banks wait for deposits to come in before they make loans. No, that's not what it means. What it means is that when the bank makes a loan, they create a deposit. That's literally how a loan is made. That's the only reason why for every loan there's a deposit. Because when the loan is made, it creates a deposit out of nowhere. Okay. In conclusions, most economists didn't see it coming because their approach to economics denies that it could happen. So, this makes sense, right? That the orthodox approach rules out bankruptcy, and don't you know it, we get financial crises with lots of bankruptcies because their model doesn't even allow for bankruptcy. The neoclassical approach that provides the foundation for mainstream macroeconomics is applicable only to an imaginary world, an economy focused on market exchange based on a barter paradigm. Money and finance are added to the model as an afterthought. They really do not matter, because an invisible hand supposedly guides rational individuals who have perfect foresight toward an equilibrium in which all resources are efficiently allocated. There's little role for government to play. The current crisis has shown this approach to be irrelevant for analysis of the economy in which we live. By contrast, the Keynesian revolution that began with a general theory offered an alternative that does allow us to understand the world around us. Keynes's different methodological approach allowed him to develop a theory that was at the same time general but also specific, in the sense that it incorporated those features of the capitalist, the entrepreneurial economy that cause it to move toward crisis. Economists working in that tradition did see it coming, and they have offered policy advice that would help to get the economy back on track and to reform it so that it would not be more stable, so that it would not only be more stable, but also so that it would operate in the interest of most of the population. And that is that. That's basically, about Keynes's revolution theory, recognizing the importance of uncertainty and subsequent relevance of money to an economy, and the fact that bankruptcies do happen, and that any sound economic model needs to be consistent with that empirical reality, right? The scientific method. We compare our theories with reality. Moving on, page 36. Minsky argued that an expansion led by private sector deficit spending, with firms borrowing to finance investment in excess of internal income flows, implies that private debt might grow faster than private sector income. Indeed, this is exactly what happened in the decade after 1996 in the United States and in some other nations, helping to create the over-indebtedness of our private sector that led to the global financial crisis. This is another reason Minsky rejected the Keynesian mainstream belief that government ought to stimulate growth by favoring investment. So, any policy that promotes private borrowing and private lending is basically a policy, ultimately that leads to instability. And Dylan and I have talked about this. For example, if the government moves towards a balanced budget, the private sector is deprived of money needed to pay the tax imposed, and thus starts borrowing from the banks. Okay, so the problem isn't solved. All that happens is shifted to a much less stable form of obtaining income, and a much more it turns the economy into a much more shaky house of cards, the more the private sector is indebted to the banks. Moving on, page 67, and this is just because it reaffirms what Dylan and I talk about a lot. This is a quote from Minsky directly. For fiat money to be generally acceptable and valuable, there must be a set of payments units must make for which this money will do. Taxes are such payments. Thus, fiat money really should not be introduced without introducing a government with taxes and expenditures. Symmetrically, money as a liability of a fractional reserve bank acquires value in the market because there exist units, the debtors to the banks, which have payments to make for which this credit money will be acceptable. The acceptability and value of a money depends upon the existence of payments denominated in that money. Thus, fiat money without a government that taxes and spends, and credit money without debtors under constraint to meet payment commitments, are quite meaningless concepts. Okay, so this is the cycle that Dylan and I have talked about. The fiat money system, basically, fiat money has value because the government has initially imposed a tax. Before even spending the money into existence, they've imposed a tax. And because people need the money to pay the tax, they have a demand for the money. And similar for bank money, when the bank extends a loan other than the fact that the money is totally backed by the state's fiat money to begin with, because any time a bank goes bankrupt and can't deliver on deposits, the FDIC will make the deposit holders whole. So, but actually, all I wanted to point out is that where taxes create a liability that makes fiat money valuable, bank debt creates a liability that makes bank money valuable. And by the way, as Dylan and I have covered on our podcast, cryptocurrency fees are needed to get access to a particular cryptocurrency's blockchain. And so as long as there's value in having access to the blockchain, there's value to the token that gives you that access. Same concept. It's beautiful how it all lines up. And Dylan and I are the only ones talking about this. Moving on. Page 68. Oh, sorry. Let me just see here. Okay. A fiat money, essentially keystroked onto balance sheets, is valuable because taxes must be paid in that money. People accept it because they need to pay taxes. The issuer of keystroked fiat money cannot run out of it and ensures that it is in demand by accepting it in payments that must be paid. Remarkably, even the chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, testified to Congress that the Fed spends through simple keystrokes and hence could afford to buy as many assets as necessary to bail out Wall Street's banks. Not that we're in favor of that, but it's just what he said. All that is necessary is to recognize that the Treasury spends the same way, and then Washington's policymakers could stop worrying about affordability of the types of programs that everyone recognizes to be necessary. Public infrastructure investment, green investments to reduce global warming and job. Okay, unfortunately, I just hit a pet peeve of mine. And we're going to do a separate episode about this incredible global warming hysteria, this unbelievable freak out, global 100% indoctrinated propaganda that, is so sophisticated, so large scale, and so wide-ranging that even a fellow like Randy Ray, who does, of course, he's not a climatologist or whatever, he can't help but squeeze that into his book here. But just my quick 2 cents. The globe has always gone through fluctuations. The Club of Rome, the United Nations foremost think tank, wrote a book called The Next Global Revolution. You can order it yourself on Amazon. You can read in there. Before the whole global warming hysteria started, they write about how they need to invent a climate scare to turn humans into the enemy of humanity, so that certain policy goals that they get into can be met. Actually, their argument is that this will unite global society. They talk about how they tried different solutions or different ideas, such as alien invasions, which we've seen that too. We've seen a lot of propaganda in that direction, but they came to the conclusion that the climate would fit the bill. This is literally a quote from the book. So climate has always changed. All peer-reviewed scientific literature confirms that man-made CO2 does not have a big impact on climate. The sun, in particular sun cycles, have a huge impact, almost perfect correlation with climate, which, not my words, this is from peer-reviewed scientific research papers that we will probably get into some other time. Anyway, to be sure, moving on here. To be sure, this is not a call for the sky is the limit spending by government. Too much spending is inflationary and could cause currency depreciation. Government spending must be well targeted and must not be too large. How big is too large? Once productive capacity is fully used and the labor force is fully employed, additional spending will be inflationary. This is also called the functional finance approach to policy, developed by Abba Lerner, Minsky's close friend. Policy should be directed to resolving problems, raising living standards, and achieving the public purpose as defined by the democratic process. There should be no preconceived budgetary outcome, such as a balanced government budget over a year or over the cycle. So, I think we're just going to close out with that because we're almost an hour into this already, and there's so much more to go. So we'll close out this episode 1, but just on that final note, I've talked about this before, where you have a certain belief that the government budget needs to be balanced at one point, right? Because I need to balance my budget, right? And every household needs to balance their budget. And so why does the government not need to balance their budget? Well, because the government is literally the opposite of a household. The government in the fiat money system is the issuer of the currency, okay? The households are the users of the currency. And this is not an arbitrary distinction, right? Because people could say, well, why is the government different than me? Well, because we are categorizing entities based on their relation to the money that is used in the system. This is not arbitrary. This is essential. This is economics is all about money, okay? So when we say, the government is the issuer of currency, households are users of currency, these are not arbitrary distinctions. These are fundamental, categorical distinctions. And the government introduces the money by imposing a tax. And after they've imposed the tax, they start spending the money into existence. So right off the bat, the system starts with a deficit. If there was no deficit spending, the government would have to impose the tax and start taking all your things because you don't have any money, because nobody spent any money into existence. Or, of course, it could be bank lending of money into existence. But as we've seen before, if money is introduced through bank lending, that increases private sector indebtedness, doesn't add to the private sector's position, which is basically liquidity preference and net private savings. And so it doesn't help. Ultimately, it will collapse. The bigger the private bank money introduced grows, or the larger the amount of it grows, the worse the crash will probably be in the end. So there always has to be a certain set of asset introduced that are not owed back, that inject net assets into the economy. And as we just covered here, of course, this doesn't mean that the government can just, then we can solve all the problems by spending money into existence. No, not what we're saying. Our well-being, etc., is constrained by real resources. The government happens to be an institution that taxes us, so we need money to pay the tax in the future and to feel safe and secure, and to consume and to expand. So that money, that kind of money that is not owed back, can only be introduced through government deficits. I am personally, ideologically, philosophically, I consider myself an anarcho-capitalist. So I'm saying, once we do away with the tax, then maybe we can have a system where we don't have a government, we don't have deficit spending. But as long as there's a government taxing you, there's going to be a fiat money system, right? Bitcoin is not going to make the fiat money system disappear just like that. The only way the fiat money system could ever disappear is if the concept of taxes is demolished is if the concept of violently taking people's property without their consent, against their will, is demolished. And that covers what I wanted to talk about in this episode. In the next episode, we will start going into some more... Well, I guess our next episode will probably be Evolution of Civilizations again, but we will pick up why Minsky matters from where we left off. And if you have any comments, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we will see you next time. This has been Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore. Well, Dylan wasn't here today, but I'll still plug his Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. And we are, of course, being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Leave us your comments, and we will see you next time.